Eggs are an amazing innovation of nature and one of the most important ingredients in baking. So today I'm going to talk about how they work and what role they play in your baked goods. Eggs, for our culinary purposes, are divided into three main parts: the white, the yolk, and the shell. And aside from being a nice little package for the rest of the egg, the shell is pretty much useless, so just get rid of it. Because of what these separate parts are made out of, they each have their own special, somewhat magical properties, except for the shell. The shell is utterly non-magical. The white is typically a structural element in baking, and I'll show you why that is. You're probably already aware of the egg white's ability to make a foam when you whip it, and that has to do with the proteins. And assume these lengths of yarn are proteins, basically long chains of amino acids. Now, straight from the white, the proteins are bundled on themselves like these two here. But the magic doesn't happen until you unravel them, and there are two ways to do that. The first way is with heat. Add heat, and the weak bonds that hold this in ball form relax, and the protein itself relaxes and becomes straight. The second way is with force. If you whip it long enough, and with the helpful pull of air and water, you'll basically rip the protein apart. It's two ways of accomplishing the same goal. Now, when you have many unbundled proteins in the same area, cool things happen. The proteins start bonding again, but not with themselves, with each other. And it creates this network full of bubbles. And if you added this egg white straight from the shell, these bubbles will be full of water from the white or whatever was in your batter. And this lattice-like network will harden as you bake and will be kind of a skeletal structure to whatever you bake. However, if you whip the white into a foam, these protein pockets will be filled with air instead. When you heat the foam up, the air will expand before the protein hardens, and the air pockets will get bigger, making the dough rise. You get leavening. Think of angel food cake. It often gets most, if not all, of its rise and soft texture from whipped egg whites that expand in the oven. The only problem with raw egg foam is that it tends to break down over time or in the presence of other substances. So if you add a little bit of copper, the copper will strengthen the bonds between the proteins and make the foam more stable. But if you don't have any spare copper powder around or don't have a copper bowl in which to do the mixing, you can add something acidic like lemon juice or vinegar or cream of tartar, and that'll have a very similar effect. Egg white proteins are very unstable in a foam, so you should always stabilize them with something if you can. Part two of the egg is the yolk, and the yolk contains just as much protein as the white, so it'll also create a foam, but it tends to act a little differently than the white because of the other things it contains. We saw that the white tends to add a softness and fluffiness to your baked goods. The yolk will add a thickness and density, and that's partly because of the high fat content. The white contains no fat at all, and the yolk is 30% fat. So while the proteins in the yolk coagulate in the same way that the proteins in the white do, the fat content makes the coagulation a little smoother, which is why yolks are used to thicken things that are meant to be smooth, like custards and soups. Fat is also flavor. So yolks will add a nice depth of flavor to whatever you're adding them to, where the whites have practically no flavor at all. The yolk also contains lecithin, which is an emulsifier. That means if you look at lecithin on a molecular level, one end of lecithin tends to grab onto water molecules, while the other end is hydrophobic. It'll actually repel water molecules and embed itself in oil. So the oil and water are held together by lecithin, whereas naturally they would separate and come apart. So the lecithin emulsifies or holds together the oil and water, which is why the yolk is so important in hollandaise sauce or mayonnaise, which are both made up of mostly water-based components mixed with oil-based components. Without the yolk, those things would separate and there wouldn't be much of a sauce at all. Let's look at the egg as a whole now. Brace yourself, because green is the color chalk I use when magic happens. If you have a whole egg in your recipe, you get all the properties of the egg white, which are structure and dry fluffiness, plus all the properties of the egg yolk, which are flavor and wet density. Now, dry fluffiness and wet density effectively cancel each other out, so without a significant change in the texture of your baked good, you get a baked good that has excellent structural integrity and excellent depth of flavor, and that is pretty cool. Let's do a chalkboard review. Parts of the egg: the white. With the raw egg white, you get a light texture. Put the raw egg white in your batter or dough and you bake it, and you get a light texture and good structure. Whip it and then bake it, you get a light texture, good structure, and some leavening. Part 2, the yolk. Adds both flavor and density. It also thickens with heat, but you want to be careful of that, because if you add too much heat or add it too quickly, the yolk will coagulate too quickly and too much and become a chunky mess. And unless you're aiming for that texture, we call it curdling. And finally, the yolk is an emulsifier of oil and water. Put these two things together, you get magic. And best of all, they come pre-measured and individually wrapped in this handy little shell for your convenience. But don't use the shell. You'll notice that I didn't do any recipes this video, and that's because I want to emphasize the fact that recipes are not the gods of the kitchen. If you follow a recipe, you'll get exactly what the recipe tells you you're going to get, nothing more and nothing less. But if you understand your ingredients, you understand how to use them anywhere. You can adjust your favorite recipe to your own personal taste, or even go into the kitchen and invent something entirely new, just with the knowledge you have of how your ingredients work. So send me questions and comments if you have them. Add eggs to the list of ingredients you've mastered and get into the kitchen and experiment. I'm Anthony, and I'll see you next time.